Hello and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event with our special guest, Jonathan Galassi. I'm Eric Lorberer, the director of Rain Taxi. We are a nonprofit literary organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature through a quarterly print magazine of critical writing, as well as through robust online programs, events, both virtual and in person throughout the year, and many other programs. Please visit us at raintaxi.org to learn more. Whether you're an occasional visitor or you'd like to become a member, we'd love to have you along for the ride. To do all that we do, Rain Taxi receives partial funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, among others. Their support helps keep most of our events, like this one, free to attend, but our most vital support actually comes from individual readers like you. So if you're able to pitch in a little something, please use the donate button at the bottom of your screen and know that even a small gift makes a big difference. There are many other ways to participate on screen. There's the chat column. Send your comments and observations there. If you have a question for the author, put that in the Ask a Question box. And of course, you can buy the book, best button of all. And today, when you purchase this book, don't forget that you're supporting not only the author and their publisher, but also the event host and a great independent bookstore based in an actual community. Tonight, that's our friends Majors and Quinn Booksellers in Minneapolis. So exciting to have School Days here in my hands and to have Jonathan Galassi with me on screen, renowned poet, translator, publisher, and now novelist, a literary icon to be sure. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. It's really nice to see you again. As you reminded me, we met about 40 years ago.
Yes.
At Washington College. I remember that visit very well, actually.
Oh, that's terrific. Wow. Yeah, and it's funny that this, of course, is set in the school setting. And before we get to it specifically, I just kind of wanted to ask, though, again, as I just said, you're associated for so many people with poetry through your own writing, your translations, the work you've done at the Paris Review and FSG. What is it that lured you over to fiction, or was it always lurking in the background there?
Well, as an editor, I've worked with a lot of great novelists, and I've always been intrigued by the writing process for them. And I wrote one other novel before this called Muse, which was published in 2015, which was really a kind of comedy satire about publishing the way it used to be when independent egos would start their own publishing houses and have a very intense personal relationship with authors. And that's sort of gone the way of many things in our culture. But I grew up when that was still a factor, and I worked for one of the last of those giants, Roger Strauss, and I was also very admiring of and close to James Laughlin, the founder of New Directions. So that world of intense personal publishing, personal relationship to authors led me to try and write a kind of little satire about it. And that was fun. And this time I started this book after school day, after Muse, and it's more personal, more difficult. It's about school in the days when I went to a boarding school. It was all boys. It was much rougher and more hard than schools are today, I think. But it's something I wanted to get into, memorialize in a certain way.
Right. It's also part of a sort of beloved subgenre, the academic novel, and even a subgenre within that, the boarding school novel. Great installments, a separate piece. to more contemporary things like prep. Um,
You're right. There's a whole tradition of
yeah, yeah. And
the
did you find working in this sort of, you know, genre that there are real challenges or things to be mindful of?
well, it is a it you know it's about kids for one thing. It's about adolescence, and so uh, that's a special period of life, and you I got into it by reminiscing about my own very intense feelings as an adolescent, and that was that you have to have connection to that, and of course everyone does.
Right,
So,
right,
and my book is also about sexuality. It's about um, people coming to terms with their own sexuality, which is something that happened to me in my life, and it's about a same-sex environment and how that works, and the different uh, effects that that can have on people.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get more specifically into it. Maybe tell the audience more about the premise of School Days.
Well, the premise is that the book is it's not told by but it's about a character named Sam Brand, who went to this school, Everett School, many years ago, and has been a teacher there. He was inspired by his teachers there, and he became one himself. And he became very close to the head of the school also. And one day, the head shows him a letter from one of his classmates way back when, um, uh, telling, intimating that he had been abused by one of the teachers. And that's the setup. Is that Sam is supposed to find out about this? He's supposed to find out what what may have happened, whether it's true, and it leads him back into memories of his own experience there and the teachers who were important to him and
Yeah,
the other students.
yeah, I
So
would say it's more than memories, like sort of um, grappling with evil still, even in the present. Yeah. Do you want to read a little bit from that?
sure, I could we talked about this. I'll read a little bit about the setup where he's talking to the headmaster whose name is Boris Crone. So Boris says, "Do you remember a student named Bryden, Ronald Bryden, class of '67? You're vintage, if I'm not mistaken." "Vaguely. I think we were in Latin 1 together." "He didn't return after third year," Boris said, rifling through a pile of papers on his desk. "Any idea why?" "None." "I had an interesting missive from Ron Bryden yesterday." He handed it over, pursing his lips while he watched Sam read. "Dear Mr. Crone, Ron Bryden, class of 1967 here, coming at you out of the blue. I haven't had anything to do with the Leverett School since the spring of 1969. At the time, I was dead certain I'd never want to ever hear the name again, let alone be in touch. Lately, though, I've been thinking that the time has come maybe to try and turn that around with a few amends made. I'm hoping you'll agree. I saw on the news the other week that the Bishop of Kansas City is going to jail for having shielded abusive priests in his diocese, and that the church is paying out substantial settlements to the victims. I wonder if you're aware of a not so dissimilar situation at your own institution involving one of your star pedagogues, the ones you're always touting as embodying what makes a Leverett education so unique. Imagine faculty malfeasance at the Leverett School, of all places, and with dire and enduring consequences for yours truly. I'm curious as to how this news strikes you and what you think should be done about it. I look forward to hearing from you very, very soon. Most sincerely, Ronald E. Bryden, Esquire. He sounds a bit unhinged, Sam said, or hurt and confused and angry. You think? And quite possibly litigious, Sam said. Have you responded? Not yet, but I will. Sam, I need you to find out everything you can about Ron Bryden's career at Leverett, his academic record, who his teachers were, where he lived, why he left. Get me everything you can on the QT, please. Boris gave Sam his trademark soulful stare. We need Ron to understand how concerned we are, above all, about him, he added. Really, there was no one like Boris. Suppose old Ron turns out to be a grifter. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, as far as we're concerned, he's a valued, long lost member of the Leverett family with something potentially important to teach us. So then Sam leaves, and he went out and sat on the bench at the base of the tower. At 5:30 this time of year, the building lights were already blazing. If he squinted, the place looked like an ocean liner, making its stately progress through the gathering dark. There was a veil across the half moon. The air was crisp as a Jonomac. The first frost had been forecast for tonight. It all came back like the slap in the face of an unexpected wave. Of course he'd known Ron Bryden, though he hadn't crossed Sam's mind in 40 years. He'd been Eddie's roommate. None of them could stand him. So that's the setup.
Well, thank you. It's such a strong opening. I love that image of the ocean liner. It's so perfect. Like this college or the high school in this case, being this journey that one takes, and it's going to be.
It's about to hit an iceberg.
Yeah. And then this revelation that the making a complaint, while of course it needs to be investigated, is also someone they didn't like, and so it just immediately makes everything so rich and complicated. Now, the thing you do next in this book that I just loved is you take us right into their childhood and give us about 100 pages of their school days in the 1960s.
Well, that's the thing. He said he hadn't thought about him for 40 years, but of course, that's what we see him doing is thinking about and remembering his own experiences and remembering Ron and his other friends. Eddie, he said he was Eddie's roommate. Well, Eddie was Sam's best friend. And so it gets complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. Going, having so much of the book set in that time, what was that like? And was that sort of the structure at the beginning to sort of use both lines? Yeah.
It was there were always two parts to the book. The present part, the investigation, and all sorts of other things related, and then the adolescent part, the old time part. And I struggled with how to relate them, how to present them. At first I thought of trying to interweave them, but I found that didn't really work. So I ended up with this long reminiscence of Sam remembering what went down. And there's one particular teacher he's very close to, who of course ends up being the one that Ron Bryden accuses of having abused him, and that's the crux of the matter. The book is really about teaching and about the different ways that people interrelate in the student-teacher relationship, and it's a very intense relationship. It has on both sides. There is sometimes an erotic element to it, and sometimes that goes wrong, and that's that's what Ron is saying here, is that that things went wrong for him, and that the teacher was to blame. And so that's at the heart of the book. Why would a great teacher do that to a student?
Right.
And
And how do
can you be
how
both
do
a
we
great teacher and an abuser? That's a paradox.
right, right. Yeah, it's a really thorny question, and I guess that that leads me to ask you as well. What, in sort of grappling with such a complicated and such an important question as the the nature of this kind of abuse. Um, uh, what sort of uh, pitfalls were you on the prepared to uh, try to
Well,
avoid as you grappled with this?
there's been an awful lot of discussion of this topic in the news and in books too, and I think that that's obviously part of what got me going writing this book, was thinking about that, and uh, thinking about uh, teachers of my own. I never had that kind of experience at all, but I know that things did happen,
Right.
and so and these schools were sort of like monasteries or prisons. Everybody's sort of stuffed in these very closed quarters, and that's a recipe for intensity, and sometimes the intensity is unhealthy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And as you read in that passage, also the layer of complication about institutions, because Boris here, representing the present day school, is sort of working multiple streams here. Getting a confidant to get involved and saying we have to take it seriously, and being kind of strategic as well about that. It's really, really layered, and I think one of the things novels can do is kind of bring all these characters and their complications to life.
Yeah, because Boris is, as you said, as you implied, but he's kind of an operator. But maybe that's what you need to be to run an institution. And you're a politician. He so that. But you're right about that's one of the reasons I like fooling around with fiction, is that there's so many nuances that you can suggest without coming out and baldly saying them. There are all sorts of these books work by implication. So it's what you consider, what you really know, what can you really know, what are the bases of your knowledge, and one thing that I think is really true is that much of what we know is really gossip, right?
Yeah.
We learn things because we're told them by people, and we don't really know how true they are. We accept them if we want to. If we don't want to, we sort of discount them. And the whole structure of relationships in an institution is often based on this kind of back and forth, in and out,
Right.
multivalenced network of relationships, and that's part of what the book is also about.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say so. I I thought that it was really interesting that it becomes less about sort of determining whether this really happened or what should be done, and more about kind of the environment, this sort of homosocial environment in which um, sexual feelings and activities may occur, and but it's very unsteady. So some of these people are learning who they are, and continue learning who they are and exploring as adults. So was that part of the intent or part of the discovery
Yes,
for you?
yeah, because I didn't want to, it wouldn't have been all that interesting to write a book and say, well, who was the teacher who he was talking about? And we dispose of that fairly early on in the book. That's not the mystery of the book. There are other mysteries that do that we get at least provisional answers to, but it's really more what you're saying. It's about the inner in the nexus of the relationships and how they affect each other, and you know and the variety of responses that people can have to similar situations too. Not everyone's the same.
Right,
So,
right. Uh, Someone from the audience is asking a question that you've partially been answering already as you unpack the book a little bit, but might as well just throw it out there in case there's more
sure.
you want to say it. But the question is, how much of the novel is autobiographical? And that is such an interesting question for novelists because we have a lot of characters and a lot of situations, and it's not necessarily going to be, as you said, you didn't have that direct experience, but
Well,
yeah.
this part of the book is not autobiographical. This part is totally fictional. Um, the other parts of the book are much closer about Sam's own experience as a student and his feeling of being alienated, which probably every adolescent feels, and that's much closer to reality. And there are other parts of this story that are also, but this whole thing about the teacher and Ron Bryden and stuff, that's all made up. It's all made up. But it's there are many stories that are just like it out there in the world. So it's made up, but it's based on gossip, as I just said.
Yeah, yeah. Well, another thing I really admired about the book, and you alluded to this earlier about the intensity of the teacher-student relationship and however it might play out. And something I love about the academic genre novel is the um, depiction of teaching itself, and how rich that can be, and how interesting, um, and how much it can say. So. Uh, Here, one of the things that frequently comes up, and uh, exhilarating for those of us who know more about your career as well, is the teaching of poetry. So much of the faculty here is an English faculty, and that's what they're imparting to students. Yeah, I wondered if you might read a little bit from that, and maybe we could talk about that.
Sure. Um, I the fact is, it was in a school like this that I became interested in poetry, and it became a major part of my life, and it was in this kind of situation. So sure, I'll read you a little thing. And Sam is an English teacher, and he throughout the book, he's actually, you see him interacting with students uh, through poetry. So this is on Monday, his English 210 spent third period working their way through Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the gold splintering, breaking when the rooms were warm. He'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? It's really a great poem about adolescence
Yeah,
and father son relations. So Sam loved the economy of Hayden's scene, the tension between generations in the house, the father's and son's chronic angers. What did the poet mean by chronic? And the narrator's too late appreciation of his severe parent's stoic devotion to his resentful son, his austere and lonely offices in straight circumstances. He was always curious what the kids would discover in the poem, how they'd relate it to their own lives. There was almost too much to say. Were father and son alone in the house? Why had the father polished the son's shoes? Why does Hayden use the word cold 3 times in 14 lines? He'd often ask to get them going. More often than not, they worked their way to an understanding of the son's grieving empathy for his father and how much these 14 lines said about a relationship, a family, a world. But there could be days when the hour dragged as if they were stirring a bowl of too dry cookie batter, and all of them, students and teacher alike, slunk away from the classroom dejected. Today had been one of those days. Peter Reno, a new sophomore, hung back when the others filed out. He was one of the quieter kids in the class, tall for his age, with an aquiline profile, a freckled complexion, and disconcertingly large, wide-spaced hazel eyes. "How's it going?" Sam said. "All right," he answered a bit sulkily, but after a moment added, "Mr. Brandt, can I ask you something? What do you mean when you say metaphor? You're all always throwing it around, and I don't know what you're talking about." "You mean like with the word use of the word cold in the Hayden poem today?" "I guess so." Reno often seemed distracted in class, and he tended to sit by himself. A metaphor is a figure of speech, one thing standing for something else. It means a transfer, a carrying over in Greek. If I say you're a long drink of water, Reno, using the image of a nice tall beaded glass of water to describe you, I'm bringing in a picture that's more telling than if I just said you're pretty tall for your age. It's the basis of all poetry, really, calling one thing something else to reveal something fresh about it. As we saw today, the cold the poet is talking about refers to a lot more than the temperature in the house. "I see." Sam wasn't all that sure he did, but after a minute, Peter said, "You're a peach, Mr. Brandt," with a big smile. "I certainly am. Now, don't you have somewhere you need to be?" Reno left the room with a spring in his step, and Sam suddenly felt a little better about the day. So that's, you see their relationship becoming established. You see them talking about how language works.
Yeah, I love that for so many reasons. Partly because, boy, it took me right back to being that age and being blown away by Robert Hayden, and just sort of how mind opening that is. For me, it was Hayden, and I had a good fortune to tell the novelist Paul Auster, who just wrote a wonderful biography of Stephen Crane. Same thing, just really opens a young person up to poetry. I thought. Um, so, but also seeing Sam as both a student when we've seen him in the 60s, and now as a teacher on the other side of this equation, and how exciting that is, but also trepidatious. He's going to be a mentor figure to a young person, and that comes with some risk.
Sam is, he one of the other aspects of the book is that Sam comes to term with being gay himself in the course of the book. You see that happen, but he's not. He's not attracted to students. He has emotional connection to them.
Right.
He has maybe how would you say, intellectual crushes on them, but he doesn't. He doesn't have the problems that some of the other teachers have, and that's part of the paradox of these things is people are different. He's gay, but he's not a pedophile. So the there are many different ways that these things are constructed. That's all.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Um, and I also have to say, the metaphor of stirring that too dry cookie batter. Wow, that really nails it. All of us who just sort of bemoan the fact that when poetry is taught, it sometimes can unexcite people rather than excite them.
Well, that, if you're teaching by the Socratic method where you draw things out of the students, if they're not being drawn out, it can be pretty deadly,
Yeah.
deadly,
Oh,
deadly.
it's
Yeah.
it was a nice penetrating insight into that. Maybe it's a good chance to talk about those various uh, roles you have, and maybe what you. I'm curious if there are aspects of having been a poetry reader and writer and editor for so long that filtered into the depiction of poetry teaching in this novel.
Well, you know, it definitely did. I mean, it was true in Muse too, that the one of the central character in Muse was this poet named Ida Perkins, and these two publishers were in love with, both vying for her attention and her work and stuff. But so I had fun with Ida, and I wrote some of her poems, and they're in the book. So here I didn't write the poems, but I did use poetry as part of the game of the book, and I enjoyed that a lot. And it was in a school like this that I learned about poetry just the same way.
Right. I want to say too, just because it's a good chance to give a plug for this other wonderful new book that you have, the FSG Poetry Anthology that you've edited. Kind of a neat companion piece to the novel because uh, we're getting the history of this wonderful poetry publisher in a really unique way, and just wanted to invite you to plug that book as well.
Well, thank you, Eric. Yes, it was our 75th anniversary last year, and because we are virtual like you, we couldn't do any readings or parties or anything. But we did. So we decided that we would publish this anthology of all the poets that FSG has published over time, and there are a lot of them. It's really a kind of mini history of certain strains of American poetry, and it goes into the future because it also shows the poets we're going to be publishing in the next few years. So it's about the continuity of our poetry list and the variety of it, and it was incredible fun to put it together with Robin Creswell, my partner in the job. And thank you for mentioning that. I didn't think of them as going hand in hand, but they do in a way.
Yeah, well, dipping one's toes into the vast ocean that is there for poetry readers was certainly a common through line for me. And coming to these iconic figures that have meant so much to me, and I'm sure to so many readers. Um, our friend Pierre is asking a fantastic question about that's maybe related to this. You're Jonathan, the publisher and editor, and you're Jonathan, the writer, and how do they relate? And is one jealous of the other? One counsel the other? Uh, how does that work for you?
Well, I always, I always aspired to be a writer, but I needed to make a living, and so I didn't, and I tried to be an academic. I didn't try, but I toyed with it, and I just decided didn't want to go in that direction. But I wanted to be involved with writers, contemporary writers. So I decided I would try publishing, and as I sometimes say, I'm still trying it. And I really had a lot of good fortune in that the people I worked with were willing to let me work with poets from the very beginning, and that was incredibly important to me. And I I found that it was very, very satisfying to see these books become reality, and I felt a great sense of uh, comradeship with the authors, and I still do. But I kept on doing other kinds of writing, writing poems, doing translations. That was always something I was doing with my left hand, as it were. I'm left-handed, so it mattered a lot. But I was always a publisher first, and I still am, really. But I have made room in my life for writing, and I'm still doing that. I have a lot of projects that I want to do, and I think that certainly working with great writers, which I've been privileged to do, you really see a lot about the kinds of decisions that are important in making a text really work. And that doesn't mean you can just turn around and do it yourself. It doesn't work quite that way. But I do see another thing about writing is that so much of it is just labor work, being able to being willing to do the work.
Yeah.
And that has been inspiring.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to ask you just a little more about that. Those lessons from the great poets and fiction writers that you've worked with. Are they, are you talking about process? Are you talking about something more emotional, or?
I think that, I have watched the process of books becoming a lot, and but the process, the real alchemy is something that happens on the page in the privacy of the author's workroom. I'm not part of that. I watch it. I get to see how A becomes B becomes C, but I think it's more about commitment and attitude, and how there's a certain kind of coldness that I think it takes to be a writer. In coldness in the sense of decision and deciding that you're going to commit your spirit and your time and your emotions to this particular activity, which is very different from what most people do. So
different, and I would say difficult. That it's you're sculpting out of sort of an infinity of possibilities. You're sculpting it down to just to a nugget. And
sculpting is a good metaphor for it, because it's about elimination
right.
of deciding what you want to put forth and throwing out. There are lots of people who spend a huge amount of their life trying to be writers and not succeeding. There's a certain how would you say, cruelty to the fact that it's not something everyone can do.
Right.
So
right.
Putting the time in is no guarantee of success.
Right. Listen, everyone. Yeah, that's the truth of it. We have a question from the audience that is picking up on something you said earlier at the start, actually, about how school was harder then, and they're just wanting you to say more about that. Is that boarding school in particular? The intensive school? What?
I mean, I went to a boarding school, so that's what I know. But I think that there was a kind of old-fashioned sort of New England idea that adversity was good for what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, sort of thing. And I think that I don't think that's the way. Just like the parent-child relationship was very different when I was a kid than it is today. Today, your kids are your friends, and um, there's a kind of false presumption of equality. That was not true in the old days. And also, parents are what they call helicopter parents now. They're so involved in their children's lives, their children's education, and you know, I'm not sure that's always so great. I think there's an infantilizing part to it, and I also think that the parents are too involved. They need to give the children room to become themselves, and so
Right.
that hardness, the difficulty of that, went back to a different approach to those, and some maybe it was neglectful sometimes.
Right. Right. It's another neat element of this book. Uh, the parents aren't there. We occasionally get a glimpse of one or two, but they're just not present. We get a very rich portrait of the students and how they interact, and then in the present of the faculty and how they interact. But it made me think of the comic strip Peanuts. It's just there are no parents in the room.
Well, the parents do come in now and then, but not much. And the fact is, if you wanted to talk to your parents, you had to stand in line at a payphone and call them up, and reverse the charges or whatever. Uh, I remember once my mother said, we called the number, but nobody was there to answer the telephone. And so they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have constant contact the way you
Yeah.
do. Yeah, we used to say, well, they dropped us off in September and picked us up in June. It wasn't quite like that, but there was a sense of that this was a world unto itself. That's what's portrayed in the book.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you. It's funny because when Muse came out, I want to say it's been about at least 5 years or so, and I thought, oh, great! There's this wonderful tradition of poets writing a novel, getting something off their chests, and I thought that was what was happening. But now I think no, Jonathan Galassi's a novelist. So do you
Well,
other? Are you thinking now? Yeah, I'm gonna.
well, I'm working on something else that's poetry right now, and I did really love writing the book, even though it was very difficult. It took me a long time. Um, and there is something fun about constructing a reality, constructing a world. You can't, you think the things you do in poetry are different, but you can create a scenario. So we'll see. I might, but uh, this was a book I felt I had to write. Let's put it that way.
Right.
So there has to do it again. I would have to feel the same way, I think.
Good. Well, I'm going to hope you do, but I'm also very glad that you have that high standard. And again, it's part of what makes really good writing so meaningful. So thank you for this, and thank you for this conversation. It's just been a treat to talk with you about this.
Well, I appreciate it so much. All right.
I want to also thank our audience out there, many people watching tonight. And as we close, I want to tell them we have other great author events coming up, both virtual and in person. We'll put a link in the chat for everyone to check them out. Also coming up is Independent Bookstore Day around the country, April 30th. And here in Minnesota, we'll be celebrating with our annual Rain Taxi Passport to the independent bookstores. We want to thank all our sponsors, but especially the Givens Foundation for African American Literature, Gray Wolf Press, the University of Minnesota Press, and the Professional Editors Network for supporting that. Wherever you are, though, please go visit an independent bookstore next week. and keep that thriving tradition alive. Jonathan, thank you for this, and for all you're doing in this field of literature that we love.
Thank you so much, Eric. Good to talk to you.
Good night.
All right.